As we continue our emphasis on End It Now, this article is entitled The Wounds of Abuse, Can We Do More? And it was published in the Ministry International Journal for Pastors, written by Dr. Katia G. Reinhardt. Mary had something important to tell her husband, John, but she had to build up the courage to say it. Finally, she told him she had been thinking about going back to school for further education. Why would you even consider that? He yelled. You failed the last course you took, so you're obviously not going to make it this time. You're stupid. You'll never last through the program, and we're not wasting our money on that. While the conversation resulted in no thrown punches, it produced wounds. It was a classic example of emotional abuse in marriage. The sad thing is, spouses such as Mary may have no idea they are in an abusive relationship, let alone know what to do about it. Pastors are the spiritual leaders of their congregation and have the responsibility to model what Jesus, the Good Shepherd, would do in ministering with compassion to survivors both in their church and in the community. There is scientific evidence that survivors may talk to their pastors before they talk to anyone else about their abuse. With their actions, pastors can either be agents of healing or unintentionally contribute to the continued perpetuation of abuse, depending on how they respond. If they have a vision, they will help build resilience among survivors by empowering them in their distress and assist in preventing by taking the time to learn about abuse. Types of abuse. Although violence affects everyone, women, children, and the elderly seem to bear the brunt of the non-fatal physical, sexual, and psychological abuse. Consider the rates of various types of abuse. 1 in 4 adults reports having been physically abused as a child. 1 in 5 women report having been sexually abused as a child. 1 in 3 women has been a victim of physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner at some point in their lifetime. 1 in 17 older adults reported abuse in the past month. Women report higher rates of lifetime exposure to rape, physical violence, and stalking than do men. Common yet unrecognized. Even though the harm of physical and sexual abuse is immediately evident, psychological abuse is less recognized and discussed, and often downplayed. Someone may say, but he or she never hits me. Is his or her behavior really abusive? Well, yes, it is, as in Mary's story earlier. Psychological abuse is not only real, but has lasting consequences. The scars of physical abuse may heal quickly, but the invisible ones of emotional abuse can take longer. Emotional abuse can destroy one's self-worth and result in shame and low self-esteem. Unfortunately, the most common form of emotional abuse is verbal abuse, and it often goes unrecognized as abuse. Recognizing emotional abuse. When we talk about emotional abuse, we must take into consideration a number of important questions. Would you recognize emotional abuse? How would you respond if someone psychologically abused you? What does the Bible say about it? As we consider such questions, we must make it clear that although women tend to experience higher rates of sexual and physical abuse than men, research in the United States suggests that in the case of emotional abuse, the rates are similar for both genders. In a survey conducted in the U.S., 8,079 men and 9,970 women responded to questions about abuse they had experienced in the previous 12 months, and also their lifetime exposure to abuse. Almost a half, 48%, of each gender reported psychological aggression through verbal aggression or coercive control during their lifetime. Differences show up in the form of emotional abuse. More women than men experience verbal or expressive aggression from their intimate partner, but both genders report coercive control by their mate at a rate of 4 in 10 people. The truth is that both men and women perpetuate high rates of emotional and verbal abuse towards their partners. The study also revealed the forms of emotional abuse. The most common reported types of verbal aggression for both genders are being called ugly, fat, crazy, or stupid, and being humiliated, insulted, or ridiculed. The most frequent type of psychological aggression used for both men and women is coercive control, involving the demand to know her or his whereabouts at all times. Women more often than find themselves requiring to report their whereabouts to their mate, while men more frequently endure insults. They also report witnessing their partners becoming angry in such a way that it seemed threatening. The prevalence of emotional abuse among Christians. Unfortunately, Christians, including Seventh-day Adventists, are not immune to this behavior. Although we do not currently have data on emotional abuse by an intimate partner among a large sample of Adventist adults, the Adventist Health Study, too, did conduct an analysis exploring the prevalence of emotional abuse during childhood among 10,283 Seventh-day Adventist adults in North America participating in the research. In this study, 39% of females and 35% of males reported experiencing emotional abuse by their parent, father, or mother before the age of 18. Exposure to such abuse had a negative impact on their physical and mental health, regardless of their age, gender, social status, income, and lifestyle choices, such as eating healthy or exercise. Being a definite concern, it raises questions about the parenting practices that may be detrimental and long-lasting. Emotional abuse versus conflict. In order to recognize an abusive relationship, it is important to differentiate between abuse and normal conflict. Conflict is common in a marriage or in other relationship and does not necessarily mean abuse. People need to have their own opinions and be free to share them. But the way one expresses his or her opinion is key. According to an expert, it is not emotionally abusive to break up with a partner. It is not emotionally abusive to argue with a partner. It is not emotionally abusive when someone reacts to what you have done with hurt. People react out of their own perception, so their reactions do not define their behavior. It is not emotional abuse to speak one's mind with blunt honesty. Perhaps the statement lacks tact, but it is not emotionally abusive. Again, just because someone reacts to what has been said with hurt does not mean that one has been emotionally abused. Emotional abuse, however, involves intentional dominance. The person chooses that behavior in order to have power and keep the other under control. How to respond to someone, how to help someone respond if they are being psychologically abused. It is important to confront the abuser kindly but firmly. Here are 5 ways someone experiencing emotional abuse can respond. 1. Study the emotional abusive tactics and learn to be assertive. Abusers use abuse as a tactic to manipulate, and dominate others. Focusing on the content makes one fall into the trap of trying to respond rationally or denying accusations and trying to explain oneself. Unfortunately, the abuser has won at that point and deflected any responsibility of the verbal abuse. 2. Set healthy boundaries. Even Christ felt the need to set boundaries in his life. We should do the same. God gave each of us our own individuality, so we must not be afraid to confront abuse or to set limits as to how much we will tolerate. In some cases, we can best address verbal abuse with forceful statements such as, "Don't talk to me that way. That's demeaning. Don't call me names," or "Don't raise your voice at me." Should the abuser respond with, "Or what?" one can say, "I will not continue this conversation." 3. Build your self-worth and self-respect. Abuse can slowly chip away at self-esteem. Usually both the abuser and the victim have experienced shaming in childhood and already have impaired self-esteem. It is important for the abused person to remember that it is not their fault. The Bible contains many wonderful reminders of how precious we are. "I have loved you with an everlasting love. I have drawn you with an unfailing kindness. I will build you up again." Jeremiah 31, verse 3. 4. Self-help from a professional counselor. If one is in immediate danger, calling the police or a crisis number is imperative. But if the situation is not so threatening, it is important to reach out to a trusted friend or family member, therapist, pastor, volunteer with an abuse shelter or domestic violence hotline. Confronting an abuser, especially in a long-term relationship, can be challenging. Seeking individual counseling, therapy, and counseling is key, but it is not advisable to start counseling as a couple at this stage because it can be unsafe for the abused to tell the counselor the whole truth with the abuser present. 5. Seek comfort, healing, and wisdom from God. The Holy Spirit is our comforter and will guide us in all wisdom and truth. He can not only warm our hearts with God's love in a healing way, but also teaches what words to say to someone who is abusive. Because Jesus suffered from all forms of abuse, including psychological and emotional, he understands. He says, "I know your tears. I also have wept. The griefs that lie too deep to be breathed in any human ear, I know. Think not that you are desolate and forsaken, though your pain touches no responsive chord in any heart on earth. Look unto me and live." Can we do more? The Seventh-day Adventist Church has for years led a public health campaign against violence and abuse called End It Now, and can be found at enditnow.org. It started originally with a focus on women and girls, and has moved to a more global focus on violence and abuse against male, female, young, and old. Too many still live under the unhealthy control of an intimate partner, parent, child, boss, pastor, teacher, or someone else who employs sexual, physical, and emotional abuse without recognizing it as such. Too many who do not recognize it and try to get help by speaking to a pastor, church leader, or fellow member still may not find appropriate, well-informed help, and instead may find themselves blamed for their situation or told to pray about it. Too many still remain indifferent, unaware, or unintentionally blind to the needs of survivors or perpetrators who are desperately seeking hope and healing from their brokenness. There is so much more we can do, and every pastor, church leader, and member must assess how they can make a difference. Doing more takes leaders and members with compassion, intentionality, and a willingness to inspire and empower others. We must not grow weary, but continue to make our presence felt in words and action, and as we learn together and bring to light forms of abuse that dehumanizes others. The health factor. Why should we do more? Many of God's children are either dying or suffering in their health and well-being as a result of violence and abuse. Health authorities tell us that 1.3 million people die worldwide each year as a result of violence in all its forms. Collectively, as in the case of gangs or wars, self-directed, suicide, or interpersonal, such as domestic violence. Such deaths account for 2.5% of global mortality each year. During the first 15 years of the 21st century, about 6 million people perished worldwide from incidents of interpersonal violence alone. But in addition to death, many are victims of non-fatal violence each day. There are survivors of interpersonal violence, physical, sexual, and psychological abuse or neglect. Non-fatal interpersonal violence is more common than homicide and has serious lifelong health and social consequences. The wounds of interpersonal violence survivors may not be visible, but are felt deeply and consequently can be crippling and long-lasting. The incarnation factor. Perhaps the most important reason to do more is that we are God's hands and feet in this world, called to represent his love and healing power and serve others as he did. Jesus summons us to treat each other with love and respect when he says, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. John 13, verses 34 and 35. In a congregation of believers that share his good news, the gospel urges us to be agents of healing and support. Finally, all of you be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. 1 Peter 3, verse 8. Therefore, it is our duty to continue reaching out to abusive survivors with compassion as Jesus did, doing what we can to prevent and appropriately deal with abuse and violence in all its forms. Jesus said, the thief does not come except to steal and to kill and to destroy. I have come that they might have life and they may have it more abundantly. John 10, verse 10. Can you do more?